You're watching The Globe. The prospects for South Africa's electoral democracy are concerning. That's according to the findings of a number of studies conducted by electoral research bodies. The studies commissioned by the Electoral Commission were concluded by the Human Sciences Research Council, Afrobarometer and Citizen Survey. And they aim to gauge citizens' perceptions, trends and attitudes regarding electoral democracy and ultimately improve the processes around voting. Well, in the last local government elections, the number of young people aged between 18 and 19 registered the lowest number of votes. To discuss this, we're now joined by Dr. Benjamin Roberts, who's Research Director at the HSRC's Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Division. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Sadly, it's not just South Africa, is it? I mean, young people around the world seem to uniformly fit into this category of not wanting to participate in great numbers in things like elections.
This evening, Peter and the viewers. Yes, that's indeed true. We tend to think of South Africa as particularly exceptional in some of these dynamics, but certainly in terms of changing norms amongst the electorate, particularly amongst the younger members of the electorate, there has been increasingly signs globally of a changing norm away from the ballot box. So in many respects, South Africa, in what we're seeing through our electoral research from the HSRC and other research institutions, is by no means surprising in that regard. So we have seen through this research a declining tendency, both in terms of registration patterns, as well as by extension, propensity to turn out and cast one's vote. The question is what drives that particular dynamic? It's very easy to ascribe it to factors such as apathy. The research, I think, shows something a little more nuanced. It's not purely apathy. Youngsters are especially attuned to politics. It's not because they don't care. So it's more around factors, certain elements of disillusionment, issues of partisanship. Which parties do young South Africans believe best suits their interests? So if not the ruling party, do any of the other opposition parties sort of fit the bill? Are they seen as competent and effective? And there are fundamental questions going on amongst young members, young South Africans, young citizens around that particular issue. And they're finding it particularly hard to find a party who, on their manifestos and also in terms of their sort of, day-to-day politics, represents their interests and needs.
It could part of the problem be that their voice isn't heard in the corridors of power, because we see it on social media, we see it loud and quite clear actually, and also often on the streets. Is it that they're being excluded where it matters most, that they've decided not to be a part of the process that puts people in those corridors of power?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of dynamics. One is in the culture of party politics writ large, and I think on the one hand there's realizing that under 35-year-olds represent approximately a third of the electorate nowadays. To what degree do political parties speak directly to that quite sizable constituency and represent their differential needs? And I think there is a fundamental underrepresentation there. And I think what we're seeing increasingly are quite critical voices coming from these under 35-year-olds. And trying to actually, going back to your previous interview, issues of accountability, issues of representation, issues of performance are increasingly matter. It's no more around a sense of blind loyalism in terms of party support. Now increasingly it's about, what do you represent, and do you speak to my particular issues, my challenges and my needs? And I think there's an element of a disconnect, and there's an element of underrepresentation of this of younger voices in the way political parties compile their manifestos and in turn even in terms of their representation, in terms of those standing for office, the question is to what extent are young voices standing for office these days across a range of parties? And it does raise real concern around representation, as well as issues around accountability and performance.
Again, you know, I'm looking to international trends because maybe, yes, we should be concerned, but maybe we are just now, as we mature as a democracy, falling into the patterns that other countries have experienced. We've just had an election in Kenya recently, and they had a heart attack. The 65% of the population that could vote voted. If 65% of Americans went to an election, there would be celebrations for a year, I'm pretty sure. So is this not just a trend and that we accept it and just work with it? Or can something be done to reverse this?
I think firstly, your point is correct, Peter. I think we can't look at South Africa in isolation from local and indeed global contextual developments. And indeed, what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, in particular globally, is an increasing what is termed democratic recession. Increasingly, countries are going through different forms of democratic reversal and democratic challenges. We're seeing the rise of authoritarian politics and right-wing conservatives winning elections. It's also, we're seeing global economic difficulties, you know, and inflationary pressures, which compound this phenomenon. So in many respects, we're not immune to those global pressures, and it does have a bearing locally on the way in which the electorate and including young voices think about their electoral beliefs and think about their electoral participation. In terms of what we're seeing, especially in South Africa, is a constellation of forces. We're seeing this declining range of quite increasingly critical democratic evaluations. So satisfactory democracy is declining. Trust in a range of crucial political institutions is dropped quite significantly since the early 2010s. And that carries across also to electoral attitudes. The sense of the belief in the duty to vote has always been quite high, but it's starting to show signs of diminishing. But where it's especially critical is in terms of views, firstly around my vote makes a difference, and especially a sense of the extent to which the elected meet the needs and interests of the electorate at large. And those have gone very particularly negative and are very instrumental in terms of the decisions the public makes about whether or not to participate in elections or ultimately abstain. And what we want to encourage is a tendency away from abstention, but also if you're unhappy with the party of choice, thinking increasingly about swing voting as a way of saying to your party of choice in the past that you're unhappy with their performance and are punishing them through the way you cast your ballot in the ballot box. But increasingly what we're seeing, and it's true particularly of younger generations, is a greater tendency towards abstention increasingly relative to older generations, rather than actually seeing other political alternatives of the ballot box as something that resonates with them.
Okay, perhaps to conclude this, in the research that you did, what kind of words did they use? Is there anything that they said, I will vote if this is the only reason why I can be possibly persuaded to come back to the voting process?
I think ultimately in what the voices that we're seeing, and we did ask that direct question in an open-ended way, tell us what would encourage you to come back to the ballot box. Ultimately, the overriding narratives, the overriding messages all relate to different facets of accountability. People want to see their needs, their interests, their particular challenges met through the different kinds of policies and issues which parties themselves put forward as part of their manifesto come election time. So really, and by extension, it's about not just promises, it's also really about seeing tangible benefits of delivery and performance. So really, the public is increasingly wanting to just see action rather than empty promises. So I think that's really the challenge. And remember that the under 35-year-olds today don't have that same sort of indelible imprint of the 94 election, that historic moment, and its significance for our society. They've come through. It is a new generation. Times have changed. That sense of allegiance and loyalty has changed, and that's not the overriding concern. Increasingly, it's about the issues that you represent, and it's the performance, proven performance on the ground that matters.
Dr. Benjamin Roberts, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right then.